how do you see then the rise of China now? That well, not just rise of China, the rise of Asia, but of course with China spearheading the whole thing. How do you think this Asian economies would they behave any differently from the European ones? In other words, is this you yeah, is this something about Asia that would do things differently, or is it every state would behave the same way under the same distribution of power?
Yeah, I'm not too optimistic that the century belongs to East Asia. I know there's a lot of talk about the East Asian century because, South Korea, Japan, China, they have the most dynamic economies. They certainly have the best and most rigorous education systems. So everyone is very jealous of how hardworking, how studious East Asian students are. But look, the reality is that Westerners like to argue. Westerners are very open. There's a free media. And so people are aware of the issues in the West, whereas in East Asia, people are much more shy. They're much more differential to authority. The media East Asians don't like to debate. So Westerners are less aware of the issues in East Asia. But let me list some issues facing East Asia that are extremely dire, okay? The first is the demographic issue. So you have an aging crisis in East Asia where people are living longer. Okay, in fact, East Asians probably have the longest lifespan of all demographic groups. Okay, so that's one. But the other thing is that East Asians aren't having children. So the fertility rate in East Asia is the lowest in the world. In South Korea, it's as low as 0.6. I think it's gone up, okay? But it went as low as 0.6. Japan is 1. China, it's 1, okay? Replacement level, of course, is 2.1. And so like in 100 years' time, 20 years' time, these countries won't have young people anymore, okay? So that's a huge, huge problem that needs to be addressed, but which cannot be addressed. Think about the amount of money that South Korea has thrown at this problem, okay? Offering tens of thousands of dollars to young couples to get married and have children. And it's still not solving a problem because young people in South Korea look at society and they see a stagnant, corrupt, unequal society that is extremely competitive, extremely hierarchical, and extremely unfair. And so they're like, okay, if I have children, my children is not going to have a better life than me. So what's the point of having a child? Okay, so that's true throughout East Asia. And I'm sorry, but if young women are not having children, that's a vote of no confidence in your society. So for people to say that East Asia is going to dominate the world, and explain to me why and how young women are not getting married and they refuse to have children. Okay, so I say that's number one. Number two is that these countries, they are where they are because of the high savings rate, okay? So South Korea, Japan, China, they export more than they consume. But let's just assume that these markets in the West, America, Europe, can all afford these goods from East Asia. What's going to happen to these East Asian economies? Well, they probably won't do very well. And China has been talking for a long, long time about shifting to a consumption-based economy. But look, the Chinese save 40% of their household savings. Okay, why do they do that? Because they have very little faith in the economy and in the growth of their country. They don't believe in the welfare pension system. They think that when I get old, the government's not going to take care of me. I need to take care of myself. It's a very pessimistic attitude, and that's why they don't spend any money. But if people aren't spending any money, you can't actually grow the economy, and that's an issue that the Chinese government has been trying to solve for a long, long time. But they can't do it because of cultural values and the political system. Okay. The third thing I will point out is that in a war in a world of global conflict, and we can expect that a lot of global conflict will arise in the Middle East, oil will be cut off to East Asia. In East Asia, the economy depends on oil from the Middle East. So East Asia is not as wealthy as other parts of the world. The Americas, okay, the Western Hemisphere is extremely wealthy, but if their economies were to be embargoed, then they would have a lot of issues. Okay, that's point number 3. And point number 4 is that South Korea, Japan, and China have never gone along historically well. Okay, they've always been in conflict. So if America were to retreat from Southeast Asia, if there's like no major hegemon to maintain a peace in Southeast Asia, then we can expect conflict to arise very quickly between Japan, China, and South Korea. And so for these reasons, I'm not actually not optimistic about Southeast Asia in the next few decades. In fact, I'm very, very pessimistic.
Yeah, no, the divisions between the countries are quite interesting. It's well, it seems as if for the Russians, for example, the most difficult relation they have in Northeast Asia would be Japan. But for Japan, the relationship with Russia seems to be almost the best one by comparison. No, just point out the difference they have with the South Koreans, North Koreans, Chinese. Um, However, it is interesting when you look at when you discuss with political economists, they often make the point that you shouldn't measure the strength of states only in military power. You have to look at the economy. But if you draw in some sociology there, it also shows that the GDP and economic numbers, they don't always reflect the health of a country either. And that's why South Korea is an interesting example, because often hailed as the most modern country in the world. If you do like, well, measure by robot density in terms of how many robots per individuals and such. So, well, I would put it on number one in terms of modernity, but you know, we could be at least it's in the top there. However, if you look at society, what does this mean? It also means they have the lowest birth rates in the world. I think they are the one around 0.62, so something horrible rate like this. It might have changed, of course. They also are a top of suicides, and and if I think they still have a minister of loneliness, and you see the media every now and then write about the crisis in the meaning, and so it does beg the question: what does this mean? As you thrive the most, you also begin to end your own existence. It reminds me about the work of people like Emilia. Um oh, no, I guess Durkheim, who wrote about the the industrialization in France in the 19th century. That the
Hmm.
areas where they industrialized the most, the suicides went up. So
Yep.
how do you make peace with this? That the more a human being thrives, the worse it does, and it goes back a little bit often to the argument whether or not. The excesses of modernity, that human beings aren't only, you know, rational individuals, that we have instincts as well. We're group animals essentially, which aren't being which doesn't always do well under this economic liberalism. That is, society essentially becomes an appendage to market forces. Is this a key issue for Asia? Because as it also China, so it just storms ahead from being essentially a peasant country in 40 years to being the leading economy and the most, yeah, scale, so extremely modern. I mean, it's quite shocking when you when you go there to see how where they are now. Is it the human component that gets lost under, I guess, so uncontrolled rapid growth?
I completely agree. I think that the future, if we are to survive and thrive as a species, we humans need to abandon these neoliberal values that have made us miserable. You know, like today we're seen as consumers. Like the more you consume, like the more value, the more status you have in society, and that's completely wrong. Okay, because it's made us miserable. It's made us lonely, and it's made us disconnected. It's made us alienated. And it's made us depressed. Like think about the mental health crisis consuming the entire world. Okay, especially in China, where you talk about suicide in South Korea, right? The suicide rate in among Chinese students is absurd, and the level of depression among Chinese high school students is just off the wall. Okay, so clearly the system is not working. As you say, if we are, what we need to do is to recalibrate our values and find what is meaningful and purposeful in our lives. And that means embracing our spirituality. It means embracing our community. And that's also what accounts for the rise of Trump, because he is presenting a new vision that gets people excited. Okay. Now, you can say it's racist, you can say it's fascist, but ultimately he is addressing fundamental human needs. And quite honestly, if the elite, if the powers that be, the 1% refuse to engage the people, if the elite refuse to help people reconnect spiritually as a community, then we're doomed as a species. And that's the reality that we live in. If things go the way that that if things just follow current trends, okay, and let's just ignore war, then eventually we're gonna die off a species because no one's gonna have children, and we're all gonna kill ourselves because of our loneliness. Okay, so we need as a society, as a world, as a species, to come together and talk about what gives us meaning and happiness in the world. And quite honestly, the answer is children, okay? How can we construct a society around children, around families, around ensuring that children have a happy childhood and become creative individuals who are resilient, who have empathy, okay? That's what the conversation we should be having right now.
Yeah, I often think about Solzhenitsyn because he was, you've probably seen his Harvard speech in 1978. That is, was very critical of communism for very good reasons. And he was invited to Harvard to essentially, yes, just go after the communists. And then instead he gave this speech where he made the point, well, everything is seen as capitalism versus communism, but they're both suffering from the same thing, which is to some extent the excesses of the modern and ignoring the pre-modern. So he pointed out that both capitalism and communism was hollowing out the spirituality in man and essentially treating it as more or less a machine. And by doing so, we're measuring perhaps success in all the wrong with all the wrong indicators.